Hi, my name is James McNab, and I'm the General Manager at Totem, and today we're going to talk about content strategy. I'm here today with Paul Ferriss, who's our Director of Editorial and Creative, and we're going to talk a little bit about how people build strategies, how they go wrong, and what you should do instead. Paul and I have worked together for, I'm going to say 2011.
Yes.
You were here before me.
Yep.
And
I've been here 10 years.
We worked in parallel for a while. I was leading digital strategy for a number of years, and Paul headed up editorial for various teams, always for CAA, right?
Yes. Mostly
then,
it started with CAA and it branched out into other clients like Acura and Geico.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, what was interesting for this for a while, and this is kind of why I want to talk to Paul about this, for some time, I was developing strategy work for Totem, and Paul's team was responsible for executing on it. And that didn't always go that smoothly.
Do you want to jump in there?
Go for it.
I think that it's a good point. It didn't always go smoothly. I think part of the problem was, and this may be one of your bigger points too, is that the strategy always seemed very much separate from the content and the execution. And I think that's where we would kind of butt heads a little bit, because the strategy, by its very nature, kind of had to be out there on its own, whereas we felt the content is a whole separate execution, and things had to be done certain different ways sometimes. And sometimes the two just didn't mesh.
And we went through a period of time where we were developing strategy work that was fairly complicated, large-scale engagements that were focused on getting kind of larger enterprises organized around different kinds of approaches. So you kind of had to have a larger system built, but then how does that boil down to what people actually produce and what gets published? And that's usually where things started to get more complicated and not so rule following. And as a strategist, you like to have everything rule following, you like to have everything organized in a certain kind of fashion, and that doesn't actually work very well. So I want to talk about kind of three main approaches to strategy, and then kind of get your take on a few of those. Sure. And then I think we can get into how some of these things fall apart.
All right.
Make sense?
Sounds good.
Cool. Okay, so one of my favorite things is people say, I want a strategic plan. Well, what the heck's a strategic plan? So
good question. What is a strategic plan?
Yeah. So
yes.
Clearly, if you're building a strategy, there's a plan involved, and you need to come up with some set of activities you do based on a certain set of decisions. And that's good to have a plan. But what makes it a strategic plan becomes one of the key questions. And so there's a couple different approaches to that. And I'll get to the one I like, and I'm interested to see whether you like it too. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But one of the key ones is to have some kind of unique insight or research that gives you information about either your brand or your consumers that then you apply to a set of things that you would do that you wouldn't have done if you didn't have that. And if that information you have is genuinely different and unique in the marketplace, it allows you to build a plan that your competitors wouldn't have, which gives rise to differentiation and engagement and all of those things that you want, and hopefully making a dent on how people behave. Mm-hmm. Makes sense, right?
Makes sense.
Of course.
On paper, it makes sense.
On paper, it makes sense.
Yes.
And of course, the research itself or the insight you're applying has to make sense too. But as an editorial person mm-hmm. And leading an editorial team, that's part of your job too.
Yes.
And I mean, when you talk about finding a story,
we would look at what problem we're trying to solve and how content can help solve that problem. And then we would take kind of the classic editorial journalistic approach to telling a story. And sometimes that gets into kind of a gray area about things that might be a little less strategic to a client. And that's where I think sometimes the strategy and where you need the strategic person, you need the editorial people to kind of come together and spell each other off and kind of show how one strategy necessarily fits into an editorial execution, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes where I think those two, like I said, they're in isolation. That's always the struggle. If these things stay in isolation, then it's not going to work.
One good example is we're working with a larger client, and they wanted a broader system of how to put together their content strategy over time. Mm-hmm. And so we built the idea of developing a narrative around their brand. And that was a bit problematic because it kind of prescribed how to talk about certain things and to build a certain set of content over time mm-hmm. that had a sense of direction, which I think makes a lot of sense.
Right.
But then the editorial team kind of said, well, that's great, but what are we actually going to talk about? And some of the things that the plan suggested they should talk about didn't turn into interesting stories.
Right. And that's always the challenge, and sometimes the problem we run into is that the things that the client might think are great that people really want to know about their particular organization don't make great stories. And because in a lot of cases, you know this as well, if you're very close to a subject, if you're within the confines of the brand and the company, it's hard to take a step back and understand what's going to resonate with your consumers. So I think that's where, you know, an agency like, you know, Totem or other content developers come in to help, you know, bridge that gap. And that, yeah, you're right. That's the kind of the problem we ran into with a few clients they tell you they've got a great story idea, and you go, maybe not a great idea, but maybe you can take the seeds of that and say, okay, maybe we can do, instead of that, what about if we did this?
We had an example with an automotive we were working with that had a couple of different stories, one of which was about the woodwork that went into the vehicle itself and the source of that wood and how it was crafted and built and put together and assembled. I think that made for a pretty good story.
Yeah.
But then in another conversation, they were very excited about new kinds of paint that had a different kind of shine to them. And it was either extraordinarily techy in terms of the technology that drove that paint, or it was kind of a weird story to follow because there wasn't much of a kind of a beginning, middle, and end there.
Yeah, and that's you're right. There isn't that beginning, middle, and end. There's no classic narrative there. There's maybe, hey, there's a little, you know, and that's a good example. That may be a little piece you could use on social media or somewhere. Hey, did you know? Here's a little fact about this thing. And that's really the only life it might have. It doesn't have to be a long form story. And I think that's where you get back into strategy. It's like there's various pieces of it. There's long form, there's social media content, there's video content, there's stuff that can live in different places. And you can, that to me is a way you can be more strategic in the way that clients can kind of branch out from their kind of, we need a plan to do this. We need to do this thing. Well, yeah, but there's a lot of different ways you can branch out. And just because that may be a great story, like I said, to a client, might not be a great story in a magazine, might make a good little tweet or something like that.
Yeah. Facts don't make stories.
They make up stories, but they help support stories. But yeah, sometimes a fact is just a fact. It's a good little thing to mention, but you don't have to go much further than that.
So there's two other aspects to building strategy I want to talk about. And one of them is this sense of building a set of principles, or themes. And this is the other thing that we've seen expressed in the past, like we're going to talk about these 3 themes, and these are going to be the main things that hold up our content, and all of the content has to be connected to that. And there's a bit of a challenge there because clients often need that, and as a client, I would expect you to ask me what kind of themes are we going to talk about, because you want to see a relationship between your brand or your product and the stories being told.
Right.
But that relationship is hard to necessarily pin down in a kind of a formal fashion sometimes, because we're trying to touch content that connects the two. It's the overlap of the Venn diagram.
I think themes are always important. I think themes sometimes get mixed up with maybe brand principles or the marketing speak around the company. And I think that's where the strategic people can come in and say, okay, well, here's the marketing, here's the brand that you're working with, but try to get to the concrete elements underneath that can lend themselves to some stories. And then that's where I think the editorial people will come in. And I always go to, what's going to make an interesting story. And when we go around and visit a client, or we talk to the people, you get a sense of the personalities, you get a sense of the kind of work they do, and you become kind of the journalist within the organization. And that's a good opportunity to go through and say, okay, well, you've got a theme over here about this. Whatever it is, it's precision crafted performance. Maybe that's a theme, that's a brand principle, maybe it's a theme as well, the idea of precision or something like that in the case of our Acura clients. But then how does that break down into a story? And I think that's where that requires some explanation between, again, the strategic thinkers and the editorial people to explain that back to the people in charge to say, here's why this leads to that, and here's why this makes a good story.
Yeah, for a few years I actually backed right off of strategy a fair bit, and obviously my role is different now, so I don't focus on that today. But one of the things that got me to pull away from doing this kind of pure strategy work was that the strategic work was the decisions made in the moment. It wasn't the planning that went into it in the advance. So you might have a specific set of things you're trying to achieve, objectives or targets, or guided by perhaps some themes and a goal you're trying to achieve in terms of that engagement. But that strategic act happens in the moment of.
Right.
It's, hey, we're trying to get at, let's say we're talking about accurate, precision crafted performance. What is the thing that we can do now with the stories in front of us that's going to most bring that to light? And that would be impossible to foresee in advance. So one of the things I want to talk about is the fact that some of these pure strategy approaches, or content strategy approaches as they're often called today in the context of editorial work that you do, they don't really play out in action very well. And you have to really be fast on the ground and look at what's available to you and make the decisions, because all of this editorial is being produced and released on a schedule. And you don't have the luxury of spending a year to develop something and then manufacture the circumstances that give rise to a good story.
I still go back to, and this is probably where you and I always had a conflict, is that the strategy becomes a very big picture, almost esoteric thing that I would take a look at and go, okay, that's great.
It ends up a bit divorced from
in events of divorce.
And
I look at it and go, okay, well, that's interesting. Good. A year down the road and say, that's very different from where we started, but it still makes sense. So there has to be, in my mind, there has to be a way to, again, to blend those two to make them work more closely together. Or is the strategy something that is less esoteric as opposed to, and again, is it all about, let's see what problems we're trying to solve and let's use content to do that? Could it ever be that simple? Should it ever be that simple? I'd love to see it be that simple instead of, I think clients get very, focused on the idea of strategy as the thing we need. Whereas they probably need a content plan, they need a content program, they need to know what they're trying to do and execute it.
Yeah. Now, I think what content strategy should do is set up a framework in which editorial can function to its best. And I think that means ensuring that your editorial staff and your leadership are there at the table when you're talking about what kind of content to produce and what the strategy should look like. And that's why I don't produce strategies anymore in isolation of our editorial leadership. In fact, usually that would be something worked out between kind of account and editorial teams to figure out what makes the most sense. And we do have inside of our parent company, St. Joseph's, strategic functions that can bring in with a broader kind of business strategy sense. But again, the whole goal there is to set up a framework in which you can find and tell good stories that connect the brand and the consumer.
Right. And that's the important part, I think, is having those conversations, particularly with the brand leader, the client that you're dealing with, to at least to do kind of that 20 questions process, the Socratic method, where you go through and ask them the questions that are, the big picture stuff that will lend itself to different stories. And I think you're right. Those things definitely, as we said before, must work very closely together. And we're fortunate to have that within the organization, that we have that capability to draw on now.
So let me summarize a couple of things. There's a lot of places where strategy can go wrong. There's a number of different approaches. Our preferred approach would typically be to build a framework that connects the broader business objectives that you're trying to engage in with the content strategy to the basis to create an environment and a decision framework for editorial teams to find really good stories. But at the end of the day, it's not about the strategy. The strategy should really just be an enabler to allow you to get to the stories that do matter and bring things forward. I think that's probably a good way to summarize our current approach to how we work with this. Yeah. And it's always a little different for every client. Every client has different specific needs or preferences in the way they see and hear things. But that would be, I think that would be the best way to think about it.
Right, I agree.
Cool. So our plan is to do a series of conversations. Sometimes it'll be Paul, sometimes it won't be me, and to talk about a number of different areas related to our business. So hopefully you'll see us again soon.